Hi, I'm Philip Anthony Albertelli, and welcome to The Week in Doubt, Episode 6, Atheism and Morality. Before we dig in, I did want to quickly reference the Easter episode, which I recently released. I think in general, I find myself lamenting the fact that I didn't make it longer. The acknowledgments and the addressing what I saw as possible mistakes or things that need to be clarified from earlier episodes ended up equaling in length the portion of the show that was meant to cover the main topic of the episode, which was, of course, Easter. So the fact that the main body of the show was roughly equal in length to the beginning or introduction to the show may have made it feel a little skimpy on content. Maybe I could have elaborated a little more on the history of Easter throughout the centuries instead of really focusing mostly on the roots of Easter. Maybe I could have talked about the different modern traditions around the world, but oh well. But I thought a fun little thing that I forgot to include in the show that I wanted to bring up was the relatively new Australian custom of, instead of celebrating with an Easter bunny, they now have an Easter bilby. I was looking for an excuse to say the word bilby. A bilby is a small Australian animal, relatively small. It kind of looks like a large mouse or gerbil. Looking at it, you'd think it was one of Australia's many marsupials, but I don't think it is. It kind of looks like a rodent, definitely a mammal, but I'm not sure which genus exactly. But it does have very prominent ears, which I guess is one of the reasons why it makes such a good substitute for an Easter bunny. So they've gone as far as replacing chocolate bunnies with chocolate bilbies. And supposedly the purchasing of chocolate bilbies helps to spread word about the endangered species, and I think also helps support their preservation. And supposedly there were a type of bilby known as a lesser bilby and a greater bilby. And this is when you're probably thinking we could have a bilby drinking game. How many times is he going to say bilby? And supposedly the lesser bilby is now extinct. If you had to lose one of the bilbies, maybe it should have been the lesser one, because I guess it turns out they had a pretty nasty temperament. Actually, I just did a little homework while recording the show, and it turns out that the bilby is classified as a marsupial. I'm looking at the information online. Class Mammalia, of course. Infraclass Marsupialia. So I guess he is a little marsupial. Good thing I took care of that now, so I didn't have to add it to a correction list for next week. I'll probably post a picture of a bilby on the Week in Doubt Facebook page a little later tonight. So if anyone who's curious wants to, they can have a look. There was one other thing from the Easter show I want to take care of. I was listening back to the finished product after I had published it through headphones, and I noticed at least what seemed to me, a horrible grammatical error or vocab error. Near the end of the show, I had been half-jokingly talking about some bunny facts I had learned while researching the show, including a process called superfetation or fetation. It's a word that refers to an animal's ability to get pregnant while already pregnant. And I think I had used the non-existent word pregnated. I said something along the lines that a rabbit could become impregnated while already pregnated, and I think it was one of those weird brain glitches, and it got by me while I was editing and putting together the recordings after the fact. it's probably one of those things that probably doesn't seem like a big deal, but I had kind of twofold reasons for wanting to bring it up. Uh, One is I just don't want to be responsible for putting junk or non-existent vocab words out into the kind of psychic bloodstream. And then also, there's also a kind of vain reason where I know people online can be brutal and pick up on mistakes quickly, so I like to correct my own mistakes before someone else starts saying that, oh, how can we trust this guy when he doesn't even have basic vocab skills or something like that. So I'm probably a bit neurotic, but I figured I'd just take care of that. Anyway, now on to the meat of the show, as it were. Atheism and morality. Now, this is one of those subjects when I first kind of came up with the idea to do a podcast about my religious beliefs or lack thereof. There were a few topics that I thought would be really important that I wanted to make sure I got around to eventually. And the topic of atheism and morality is one of those. I think one of the key reasons why religious people tend to resent or fear atheism, or why they're suspicious of it, is this assumption that atheism doesn't have any moral core. And without religious morality to guide us, society or civilization will basically decay and collapse. I suppose a starting counter argument against that sentiment would be that we know religion doesn't guarantee moral behavior. I mean, if you want to go back in history, you can look at those kind of hackneyed but true examples that people usually give from the Middle Ages, the Crusades, witch hunts, inquisitions. And if you go down to today, things like the bombing of abortion clinics, fundamentalists, Mormon, polygamists marrying children, and then things as severe as massive terrorist attacks like 9/11. You can probably tell that I'm going to be laying into religion a bit. So I want to stop and make a point that unlike some prominent atheists that I really admire, including Christopher Hitchens, who is one of my intellectual and literary heroes. And I would also say probably Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris as well. Unlike them, I think I've talked about this before, I'm not as focused on the possible social ills caused by religion. My focus has always been probably maybe more selfish and more personal, where I just have that itch that needs to be scratched, where I want to get at the truth about why I'm here, about existence, the afterlife, whether or not there's a creator. I just believe if you only go around once that we know of, how can you not want to know the honest answers to those things? And I'm just compelled to try to find them. So I'm not as focused on trying to uproot religion to get rid of certain social ills. That being said, I think that religion can certainly be used at the least as an excuse to commit acts of terrorism or violence, or maybe it's kind of like an accelerant, like gas on the fire. It just adds further impetus. But I think even if there were no religion, I think human beings are somewhat tribal by nature. And as much as we have the potential for good in us, we can also be tribal and violent. And we probably would still find reasons to attack one another, whether it's political reasons, land, perceived slights, things like that. But religion probably does act as some kind of accelerant or at least an excuse. It seems that when you bring up the subject of atrocities done in the name of religion, religious people often say, don't blame the religion itself, blame the people perverting it. I know it's unprofessional, but I just had to stop to say that if you just heard a noise in the background that sounded like a typewriter or tap dancing, that was actually my chihuahua scuttling around underneath my desk looking for I don't know what. But that's Olive's first appearance on the air, I think. Anyway, back on topic. As I was saying, often religious people say, don't blame the religion itself, blame the person perverting it or using it as an excuse. And there probably is some legitimate truth to that because so much of religion is open to interpretation. And if you look at Christianity, for example, there's definitely a change in tone from between the Old Testament, New Testament. Jesus is definitely more of a pacifist, someone concerned about social injustice, and I guess you could even say peaceful resistance in a way, render unto Caesar and self-sacrifice, that type of thing. Whereas the Yahweh of the Old Testament is a bloodier figure. But that all being said, you could also make an argument that if a religion does contain examples of violence, or if it seems to send a message that violence and strength, harsh actions are sometimes the answer, that maybe you can also blame the religion a little when people commit acts of violence, supposedly for religious reasons. Think, for example, if you look at both the Old Testament and the Quran, they're both at times, I think, books filled with wisdom, insightful parables, maybe even literary beauty at times. But that being said, there are also books that sometimes condone the violent conquering of the other, of those who don't believe in the same God. So in that sense, I think that the religious might not have as strong a footing as they think when preaching morality. Well, what about atheism? Does atheism have a moral core? Well, once again, I think that atheism isn't a religion, it's the absence of religion. So there is no dogma or doctrine about how an atheist should behave. But I do think that sometimes morality is one of the factors that leads people to become atheists. And what I mean by that is, although ideally it should be your sense of reason, your rational worldview that leads you to be atheist or an agnostic, there is sometimes an emotional factor too, or at least partly emotional. I think a lot of us have had those moments when we've seen things that offend our moral sensibilities so much, whether it's a natural disaster, an example of man's inhumanity to man, horrible stories about children born with horrific birth defects or things like that, and where we kind of instinctually go, oh, there is no God, or maybe on some level the thinking is more, or at least there is no good God, because how could a good God allow such things to happen? So in that sense, I think there can also be a moral factor in why people choose atheism over religion. I think another moral factor for me too is I always talk about, the search for the truth. And it does offend my moral sensibilities in a way on a lesser scale that people would choose or expect me to choose, not to be too harsh, but for lack of a better word right now, a fairy tale or some kind of palliative story over the search for the truth. They should settle for something because even though it might not be true, even though it may be made up, since offers you some kind of consolation or something like that, that you should choose it over the search for the truth. And that's always offended me too. It's probably part moral indignation, part rebellious streak, where you don't want to settle for the illusion. You want to fight your way to the truth. And it's kind of interesting while we're on the topic of that instinct or that reaction to sometimes say, there is no God, or how could a good God allow such a thing? It seems it doesn't matter how learned, wise, or quick on their feet a religious proponent or theologian is, they always end up at the end of the day stumped by that one. I've watched a lot of debates between religious people and atheists, and like I said, no matter how quick or smart the religious proponent is, they always end up having to say that they don't know why bad things happen to good people, or why a good God would allow, X, Y, or Z to happen. I think some people might come up with the weak argument that we're being tested, it's a test of our faith, or maybe, and I find this morally offensive, some people blame it on the fall in the garden, blame it on man, because two people in a parable ate the wrong piece of fruit. All of mankind, kind of a domino effect, and that goes down the ages. All of mankind have to suffer the consequences in the most horrific of ways, and it's our own fault. I find that kind of outrageous. Well, if we can't definitively trace the root of morality to religion, where does it come from? Do we have any proof that maybe it's biological or evolutionary? I think there might be some evidence of that. There's what scientists call proto-ethics. It's a kind of rudimentary examples of morality and non-human species. For instance, there's certain monkeys and animals like meerkats that will actually, when they spot a predator, will kind of raise a vocal alarm and warn the other members of the group that danger's coming, even though it draws the danger more directly towards themselves. So that's kind of example of animal altruism. And you can see that type of thing a lot in primates, where a lot of primates will, for example, chimpanzees will groom each other and share in child rearing responsibilities. I think we can also see the sharing of child rearing responsibilities in a lot of other species too, including elephants, I believe. For some reason, I always think it's kind of interesting or inspiring when you see some basic example of morality in maybe a species you wouldn't expect it from. I remember watching a nature documentary, and it always stayed with me. there was a mother crocodile. So here's this animal, one of those animals that probably has a tendency to haunt our nightmares, like sharks or prehistoric monsters or giant reptiles, things like that. And it uses these immensely powerful jaws to crush its prey and trap them in a death roll, and etc. But at the same time, mother crocodile is very vigilant, and when they hear the peeps of their hatching chicks, they'll actually go to the shore, scoop the babies up gently in those same jaws it uses to crush prey, and guide them into the water and give them their start in life. I think examples of the maternal instinct are probably some of the most common examples of basic ethics that it's observable in animals. Of course, not all animals demonstrate a strong maternal instinct. I think a lot of animals, especially amphibians and fish, things of that nature, once you're born, you're on your own. But there are some exceptions in cold-blooded animals, and, like I just talked about, the crocodile. And of course, mammals, the mother will often literally defend their young with their life. Of course, it's not all sunshine and rainbows in the animal world. There's fairly plentiful examples of cannibalism and cruelty. I think one disturbing fact that's always kind of stayed with me is this habit among certain male bears, the males in certain bear species, where they will attempt to kill a female's young in an attempt to spur on an attempt to spur the female bear that much sooner into heat so they can mate with her. And of course, to our relief, the mother doesn't want any of that, and she literally defends her young with tooth and nail. And also in the case of chimpanzees, I remember for a long time they're supposed to be our kind of gentle, wise cousins. Obviously, we have about 99% genetically in common with chimpanzees. They're our closest animal cousins. And we long had this kind of maybe overly idealized view of them as being gentle. I think it was Jane Goodall who, after a period of time, discovered that there was indeed a dark side to chimpanzees. And there's some really disturbing, brutal examples of violent behavior. Sometimes female chimps stealing the babies from other female chimps and killing them. Male chimpanzees from one group roving in bands, tracking down lone males from other groups and basically ravaging them and beating them to death. And I think sometimes even there may have been examples of cannibalism. Disturbing stuff, and automatically I think when you hear that there's this instinct towards revulsion, but when you think of it, it's not really any different than us in a way. The human species is probably roughly 250,000 years old. Some people mark it as less, some more, but that's the rough estimate, something like that. And here we are in the modern age with iPhones and everything else. And if you take step back and look at mankind as a whole, we're still committing atrocities and killing each other all over the place. So in a way, we're really don't have much right to wag our fingers at the chimps. But that brings me to the bonobos, and they're kind of a ray of light that gives us some hope They're I would say they're basically an offshoot of the chimpanzee, and they almost look identical to a chimp, except they're a little smaller and slighter built, and they're kind of the hippies of the great apes. They basically live in matriarchal groups, meaning that they're pretty much run by an alpha female, and relatively peaceful creatures, and very highly sexualized too. Instead of solving conflict disputes with violence, they usually settle them with sex, and they're basically bisexual. And often a female will resolve a dispute with another female sexually. So we got kind of discouraged by this dark behavior among chimps that was discovered, but luckily then we had the bonobos to kind of cheer us up and give us a brighter view of the great apes as a whole. I think I may have heard some people, apologists, chimpanzee apologists, is there such a thing, who try to chalk up that dark behavior I described amongst chimps as aberrant. Maybe it had something to do with encroachment, the encroachment of human civilization on their territory or something like that. But I don't know. My guess is it's probably a dark side that's always been with them, unfortunately. But then again, I'm not a primatologist. And while I'm at it, and maybe this will help cheer us up after all that talk of chimpanzee psychopathy. Is that a real word? Here's some other examples of animal altruism from online. Dogs will often adopt orphan cats, squirrels, ducks, even tigers, according to this. But we've probably all seen those weird news stories where that odd kind of juxtaposition of species where they will take like some kind of baby animal from a zoo who's lost its mother, and they'll pair it up with a dog with a good maternal instinct. Supposedly animals like dolphins will support sick and injured animals, in particular dolphins, by swimming under them for hours. And mongooses can be pretty nasty, but it says here that they've been known to support the elderly, sick, and injured. Wild canines like wolves and other wild dogs will bring food back to members who weren't present at the kill. Vampire bats will regurgitate blood to share with unlucky or sick roost mates. Walruses have been known to adopt orphans that have lost their parents to predators. So you can see what I'm trying to get at. It's funny, sometimes, I think even I'm guilty of this. If we hear about a human who does something completely awful, some kind of violent or debased act, we'll say, what an animal, or that person's no better than an animal. But if we look at animal behavior, although there are some really negative examples, there's also some really good examples. And anyone who's ever owned a beloved dog knows that animals, in a way, can be a lot more pure than us. But that being said, I think what I'm trying to illustrate with all these examples of proto-ethics and animal altruism is that there may very well be a root for morality in biology or evolution. That reminds me of something, and I'm paraphrasing, that I think Christopher Hitchens used to say, something to the effect that our religion doesn't inform our morality. Our basically innate or evolutionary morality informs our religion, or imbues our religion with morality. So basically, in his opinion, we don't get our morality from religion, although I think religion, the better parts of it, uh, the more benign and selfless teachings of religion can help to reinforce our morality. But he was kind of saying we don't get our morality necessarily from religion. Religion gets its morality from us. I think at the end of the day, whether you believe in God or you don't, whether you think morality comes from religion or whether it's encoded in our genes, one thing we really have going for us is we're self-aware. For the most part, as far as we know, the only truly deeply self-aware animal. Maybe you could probably get into an argument about how self-aware the other great apes are, or certain other highly intelligent animals like dolphins, or maybe even dogs to some degree. I believe they call it, to some degree, it falls into the area of theory of mind. That might bring us into the topic of empathy. But I think theory of mind not only has to do with the self-awareness of an animal, but its ability to abstractly think about the state of mind of another. You know, the way our dogs seem to be able to sometimes, cock their heads and read our thoughts and or read our facial expressions or whatever. But I think it's safe to say we're the real deeply thinking, deeply self-aware animal on the planet with a command of highly complex language and abstract thinking and reasoning. And I think what that does for us is it allows us to choose our own fate, or choose our own moral identity. We don't have to be stuck with archaic religious moral mandates, and we don't have to be a slave to our evolutionary bonds. We can choose how moral we want to be. And I think we all have, even though, like I said, humans can be tribal and violent, I think we also have in us, and there's probably evolutionary benefits to it, the propensity for empathy and compassion and being self-aware, thinking animals. We can choose to exaggerate those positive characteristics, and I think we should. I think all of us should try to be as good as we can be, to try to be as empathetic and caring as we can be. So I think that basically brings me to the end of this talk on atheism and morality. Now, once again, thanks for listening, and be good. I know I'll try. All right, man. Oh, don't forget to like us on Facebook and look for the Weekend Out.